Hello, I'm Connor Bernstein with the National Mining Association. You're watching NMA-TV. No one has sounded the alarm louder about the nation's eroding grid reliability like former Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Chairman Mark Christie. I had the distinct pleasure of recently sitting down with him to discuss reliability and the challenges now facing the nation's supply of power. Mark, thank you so much for being with us.
Connor, glad to be here.
This is an incredibly timely moment for all things electric reliability and electric markets. You were chair at an extraordinary moment, this collision of reliability concern with soaring power demand. How do you see this unfolding? How do we navigate it?
Connor, I think we're facing a crisis. I've been talking about a crisis for 4.5 years. First, I was said to be, yelling the sky is falling, but now we know that the crisis is real. And it's simply a supply and demand imbalance. We're seeing incredible, unprecedented increases in demand driven by data center development. And on the supply side, we're not only not building sufficient dispatchable resources, but we've been losing dispatchable resources, predominantly coal. So really it's a simple problem, but it's also a frightening problem. And that is demand is skyrocketing, supply is stagnating. That's the fundamental issue. And yes, that's why we're at the crisis point. The crisis of reliability is no longer over the horizon. The crisis is across the street.
And as scary as it is, and while we finally have capacity markets kind of screaming that we not only need to build new capacity, but keep existing capacity, we're seeing that in PJM, I suppose we're seeing it in MISO. Do you think that we need more intervention to get this dispatchable capacity built and to keep these plants online?
Okay. Let's separate the market approach in these RTOs from about a fourth of the country stayed on a traditional model of state-regulated rate-based generation. I think in the non-RTOs, the problem is not nearly as acute because in the non-RTOs, utilities can maintain dispatchable generation with the approval of their state regulator. It's being financed through rate base. And they can build new generation with the approval of their state regulator. It's being financed through rate base. So the heart of the reliability problem is really coming in the RTOs where these markets have not been financing either A, retaining the dispatchable generators like coal because the market structures are not providing sufficient revenues for them to stay open, or not building sufficient new dispatchable because, again, the markets are not giving the incentives to get new generation. So I think in the markets, one of the things that has to be looked at, too, is the markets are not valuing reliability attributes. And that's one thing where FERC, I think, is going to have to ultimately step in. I would prefer that it come from the RTOs themselves. And they have been making some steps forward. They've been, ELCC is another acronym. We have a lot of acronyms in this business, but ELCC is basically an acronym for how do you accredit generation. And the major RTOs, PJM, MISO, SPP, have made improvements in their accreditation, in their ELCC methodologies, to start moving towards methodologies that are more focused on what performance characteristics are we actually getting from generation. But I think there's a long way to go. I'd prefer to see it come from the RTOs. FERC always can step in and force them to do it through what's called a 206. Preferably, the RTOs themselves will continue down in this direction, but they got to act fast. I mean, the crisis is here now. So this can't be something that the RTOs get around to in 5 or 10 years after, a 5-year stakeholder, talky talk session. It has to happen soon.
And then with the speed that demand is coming, there are some folks say, if we can just get a breakthrough with permitting and transmission, problem solved, we're going to be able to get variable power from windy, Great Plains, solar from the Southwest. We're going to be able to get it where it needs to go. I know you have expressed real concern about transmission being no silver bullet.
Transmission is not a silver bullet. Transmission doesn't generate a single electron of power. Transmission simply moves power from where a generator has generated it to ultimately to an end-use customer. Now, we have to have transmission. We have to get the power from the generator to the end-use customer, so of course we need transmission. But transmission alone doesn't generate a single electron. If we're short on generation, there's nothing for transmission to move. And in RTOs like PJM, for example, there's been a practice over the last several years of states that are deficient in generation, they're in deficit in generation, they're importing power. Say, well, we can import power from another state, but if every state gets short, the old saying goes, if everybody is leaning on everybody else, everybody's going to fall down. And that's been the dynamic in these RTOs. Transmission is needed again to move from a generator to an end user. But transmission is not going to create electrons. Let's be clear. And transmission is also extraordinarily expensive. And so we need to build transmission, but we need to be careful to build the transmission that actually has a purpose and not a purpose of just a spec transmission that, because maybe somebody wants to build a wind farm 500 miles away. That's not a reason to build transmission.
And if I can double down on that for a second, there are folks that think intermittent resources are ready to carry grids. You have been very firm that we need more dispatchable capacity.
Yes.
Do you feel like variable resources are ready to carry the load on grids?
Well, I use the terms dispatchable and intermittent. I know when I first got to FERC, they were trying to move to these euphemisms of variable and flexible or something and try to disguise what's really going on here. I just use the terms that are straightforward, intermittent and dispatchable. Intermittent resources, like wind and solar, that's what we're talking about, are a good energy resource in the real-time energy market because when they're producing, obviously they're producing at zero marginal cost, but they're not a capacity resource because let's remember what capacity is. Capacity is the ability to deliver power at a future point. That's capacity. Energy is delivering power this second. And wind and solar, when they're producing, are a good energy resource. But when they're not producing, they're worth zero. So capacity is what you have to plan on. Capacity is what you have to plan your system around. You can't plan your system around hoping that the sun is shining at peak. You can't plan your system hoping that there's a very windy day at peak. You have to plan your system based on resources that you know will deliver when called upon. And that's why the core reliability resource is going to be a dispatchable resource and has to be because of the nature of the grid. We can't base the grid on, well, over 12 months, wind and solar will give you 20%. We don't need 20, we need, fine when they're running, good energy resource when they're running. But you have to have the dispatchable resources because you have to run the grid. Here's the thing about the grid. The grid has to be balanced. Supply and demand have to be balanced every second of every minute of every hour of every day of every month of every year. There is no time when it doesn't have to be balanced. And the only way you balance it is you have supply every second. Every second. And that means dispatchable resources have to be available because you simply can't depend on an intermittent resource being available when you need it. You can't. That's just physics. That's not Mark Christie's opinion. That's just physics. And we need to accept the reality of that physics.
And speaking of the physics of all this, fuel security is a real concern. We are seeing what dispatchable capacity is being built is gas.
Yes.
But there are challenges in getting pipelines built. We have also seen some real concern about fuel delivery during peak demand during winter months. How concerned are you about fuel security and about this reliance on a gas system that perhaps you don't have quite as much control over as you'd like?
Huge concern. Look, every generating resource has pros and cons. Okay, there's never been a perfect generating resource ever created. So with gas, and I'm an advocate of gas, because it is the dispatchable resource of choice today as far as new construction. There's no doubt about it. But gas comes with its own weaknesses, and one of which is gas generators burn gas, and gas has to be delivered on a constant basis. And that gets into the issue of the fuel security. And what we've seen in RTOs like PJM is there's some generators that don't have firm supply. They want to buy interruptible supply because it's a lot cheaper. And their model is we can get in the market with cheap gas, we can make money, and if gas is expensive, we'll just shut it down until we get through that crunch. But the crunch is what's called a peak, and that's when they need to be running. Now, gas that's owned by utilities generally gets firm supply, and that firm supply is critical at times of peak because those gas generators are going to have firm supply. Now, firm supply is more expensive, of course, but when you need gas generators to run, firm supply is much more valuable than interruptible. So it's a major problem. And of course, the other problem with gas supply is the more we build combined cycle gas, which we need to do, or CT peakers, but combined cycle is what we really need because they're the base load generation. It takes a lot more gas being delivered because gas molecules have to be delivered. How are they delivered? In a pipeline. And we all know building pipelines is not easy. It's a high capex asset, very expensive to build, and obviously you run into the environmental opposition, you run into the permitting issues, but there's still no choice. We have to build a lot more gas. We have to, and that means we got to build the pipelines to serve them.
How challenging was it to again and again raise the concern about reliability as a commissioner, then as chairman, and to really not get much of a response from the last administration? It almost seemed like you were dismissed.
Yeah.
What was that like? What were those interactions like?
Well, let me say this. My philosophy in public service, and I spent 17 years on the Virginia Commission before I became a FERC commissioner. And I came to FERC after 17 years as a state commissioner and learning this stuff. And I went to FERC with one goal, and that was I was going to tell the truth based on the facts. And whoever didn't like it was too bad. And Gandhi said, you may be a minority of one, but the truth is the truth. And so when I got to FERC and I saw what was coming, because I knew it from being a state regulator, I wasn't going to be reticent, and I wasn't trying to avoid taking somebody off. My view is if you don't tell the truth when you have the opportunity, then shame on you, not on the ones who don't want to hear it. And so I started saying that the reliability crisis is coming. It's here. It's very, and I started saying it from the very beginning when I got to FERC because I saw this coming in Virginia. So, yes, it was lonely in the early years. The Biden administration obviously had no interest in promoting dispatchable generation. In fact, they had the interest in shutting down coal and not building gas. And their power plant rules that they came out with were absurd. They were deliberately designed to destroy the coal industry and make it impossible to build new gas. That's what they were designed to do. And that would have been a catastrophe for reliability. So I felt, look, my job when I had the opportunity of public service was to do it to the best of my ability, speak the truth, speak the facts, no matter who didn't want to hear it. And that's what I did. And I'm glad I did it.
Thank goodness you did it.
Well, I'm glad I did it. And, I look in the mirror and I don't have any regrets.
You talk about it being a catastrophe. We are now in a moment where speed to power is everything. Mm-hmm. The coal fleet has a unique opportunity. It's there. It is in many places underutilized, although we are seeing demand for coal growing. How do we ensure these plants stay online, and how do we potentially get more out of them?
Coal plants are going to stay online if they have the financing to stay online. It's fundamentally an issue of financing. Coal plants that are owned by utilities that are in rate base, which are the traditional states like the Southeast and Rocky Mountain, that's going to be a state regulator decision. And I think that a lot of state regulators in those states understand we have to keep these coal units running. So rate-based financing is a much more dependable source of financing to keep those units running. The problem really is in the RTOs and their markets, because these markets have not been conducive to keeping reliable generation like coal running. For a lot of the reasons I've talked about, the accreditation does not fully recognize the reliability attributes of dispatchable generation. And And that is going to have to be addressed. For those states who've chosen to let their utilities go into these markets, we've got to look at why we're losing the dispatchable resources, why we're not building the new dispatchable resources. It's market structures. And I think these market structures are not anywhere near remotely ready to build the generation, to retain the generation, to serve this wave of data center demand that's coming. Not even close. I mean, even if we stayed in flat demand, even if we stayed with the load forecast being flat, we would still be in a problem because we're losing dispatchable resources. But it's far worse than that, because not only are we losing the resources, but load is not staying flat. Load is skyrocketing because of the data centers. And these market structures in these RTOs are not even remotely capable of meeting that demand.
You have just left the commission. You are talking about an extraordinary moment, soaring demand, real concern about reliability. If I can ask you a hypothetical, you're given a magic wand, you're able to take control of the situation. What do you do?
Well, as a lawyer, the first thing I'm going to ask is, what are the legal attributes of this magic wand, and what authority do I have? If I had a magic wand where, you weren't doing the usual legal calculation about everything, I think, President Reagan used to say, there may not be easy answers, but there are simple answers. And I thought he was right in what he was saying. The simple answer is, we have to meet load, and that means we're going to have a lot more dispatchable generation. That means we keep coal operating. That means we build new gas, and we're going to have to build new nuke, and it's going to be extraordinarily expensive. But that's the only way to keep our power crisis from really resulting in mass outages. It's a simple answer. It's not an easy answer, because there's a lot of interest groups that want to see coal shut down. You know who they are. There's a lot of interest groups that don't want to see gas get built. And they had sway in the last administration. But the reality is, we have to have these dispatchable generating resources. We're not going to keep the grid functional without them. And we don't just need to keep the ones we have, we got to build a lot of new ones. That's a simple answer. It ain't easy, but it's the simple answer.
Thank you so much for your time and for your attention and your service.
Well, thank you. Enjoyed talking with you guys.